We're going to talk about one of the most complex issues for the hand surgeon and in hand surgery, and that's the hood shift. The extensor hood, for anatomy purposes, is shown here on the dorsal aspect of the finger. We have the central slip, which is a continuation of the extensor tendon. We have the lateral bands, which are on both sides. There's a small triangular ligament where the two join the distal phalanx. I've left off the transverse lamina of Landsmeer, which circles the middle joint. The oblique arcuate fibers run from the lateral band to the central slip, and from the central slip to the lateral band. And lastly, we have the sagittal bands that run from the central slip around to the volar plate. The purpose of the sagittal bands is to maintain this tendon centered on the top of these little mountains. The tendon doesn't want to stay there, and you see that in rheumatoid arthritis very quickly when attenuation of the hood allows the tendon to ride right off the hood. So the sagittal bands are necessary to maintain the centralization of the tendon over the bone. If we have the intrinsics firing, they are volar to the axis of rotation of the MP joint. The intrinsics are all the lumbrical and interossei that lie volar. This is the lateral band, and the lateral band is always volar to the MP joint. Therefore, they are flexors of the MP joint. These two lateral bands then run beyond the middle joint and insert on the distal joint, making them dorsal to the motion axis of the middle joint and the distal joint, making them extensors. So when the intrinsics contract, they produce the intrinsic plus position or the protected position of the hand. The extensor tendon, central slip, ends on the base of the middle phalanx. If I cut the median and ulnar nerves and paralyze all of the intrinsics, the finger assumes a claw position. Now, from all we've said so far and what we know, that's impossible, because we have an intact extensor communis tendon that comes over the MP joint, of which it's always an extensor. This is the central slip up the back, and it inserts on the base of the middle phalanx. Therefore, that extensor tendon should be able to straighten the middle and distal joints, but it can't. The central slip cannot pull this joint up. So we send, if you will, an erg of energy up the extensor communis tendon to central slip, but all it will do is pull the proximal phalanx back further and won't extend these two in the face of totally paralyzed intrinsics. What happens? What happens to this erg of energy that we send from the muscle up into the tendon? Where does it go? Why can't it extend that middle phalanx? Because all of the anatomy shows us that it should. If you read Hollinshead's anatomy, they discuss a filmy attachment of the central slip to the base of the proximal phalanx, and they're crediting that with extension of the MP joint, and it doesn't exist. It's not there. There is no attachment to the base of the proximal phalanx. So where does this erg of energy go? This is what happens. We call it hood shift. The energy comes up the extensor tendon and shifts into the sagittal band here. So that erg of energy goes here, and the extensor tendon is then loose, and that's why it can't pull the middle phalanx back. And the harder you pull, the more the finger claws, and the further back the proximal phalanx comes, as this muscle pulls through the sagittal band on the volar plate and actually creates more dorsiflexion of the proximal phalanx and no effect at all on the middle and distal joints. If I take a claw finger and I just passively flex the MP joint, you can barely see the amount of degrees I put into it, the finger will extend fully. I've created a situation where that erg of energy that we sent up the communis tendon can find its way to the middle and distal joint. And I do that by just passively flexing the MP joint. What happens? First of all, it's a little like a man standing at the end of a football field with a ring in his hand attached to two cables that run the whole length of the football field and a little gauge at the end on each side. And he can take that ring and move it toward me just a fraction, theoretically a millimeter. But you'd only have to move it a little way, and this one will read 0. This one will take 100% of the 10 pounds he's pulling. The load will be entirely on that one. If he takes that ring and moves it to the right, this one will fall to 0, and the entire load goes up to this one, and it reads 100%, or the full 10 pounds he's pulling. And that's a little the way this works. Just this fractional motion at the end of a football field changes the load in the cable from 100% to 0, and then reverses it to 0 to 100%. And what happens here is if you passively flex that proximal phalanx. So what we're going to do here is just push it down a little bit. The dorsal part of that sagittal band comes distally. The volar part of the sagittal bands moves with the volar plate proximally. So that little bit of passive flexion changes the sagittal band from something that lies like this and steals all of the load of the extensor tendon to something that lies like this. We create a little bit of flexion of this proximal phalanx. The volar plate moves that way. The sagittal band goes from here to this, and when it does that, it now has a little excursion dorsally. And that excursion dorsally lets all of the load come up to the base of the middle phalanx and fully extend the finger. And that's hood shift. Just that tiny shift in the position of the MP joint will allow your load from the communus, which is functional, to substitute for the paralyzed intrinsics. And the load comes up just like a railroad track switch. Instead of going into the sagittal band and pulling the proximal phalanx backward, it can go up the back of the finger and will straighten that finger all the way up. Hood shift.